Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are getting into something a bit different, but absolutely fascinating. We're taking a completely impartial look right under the hood of modern political commentary to see exactly how narratives are built. Now, we aren't taking any sides today, we're just mapping out the raw data and the rhetorical strategies that a commentator uses to construct a much broader worldview. It is honestly a masterclass in seeing how entirely disparate data points get woven together.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We've got 4 totally distinct stories on the docket today. We'll be looking at shifting voter demographics, redistricting and court rulings, some wild Michigan Medicaid fraud claims, and finally, the Spirit Airlines bankruptcy.
All right, Section 1, Shifting Voter Demographics.
Starting us off with shifting voter demographics, the commentary focuses heavily on polling data here. Specifically, they rely on this quote from CNN data analyst Harry Enton. Republicans are chipping away at this long-term advantage that Democrats have had among African Americans. Now, the commentator takes this analysis and uses it to strongly argue that former President Trump is rapidly growing his coalition heading into the midterms, especially among young voters, independents, and Black Americans.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact piece of data the source uses to anchor that whole claim. We're looking at African American approval for Donald Trump. During his first term, that approval sat at 12%. But according to the polling cited in the commentary, it's now grown to 16%. Now, I know what you're thinking. A 4% bump might seem pretty small on the surface, but the source emphasizes that strategically, it represents a highly significant trend for Republicans, especially when you're talking about incredibly tight down-ballot races.
To really hammer this demographic shift home, the source points to a massive 12-point drop in the overall party ID margin advantage among African Americans. The commentator notes that during Trump's first term, Democrats held a massive 63-point advantage in party identification. Fast forward to the cited data today, and that advantage has fallen to 51 points. The source frames this double-digit drop as a historic low for Democrats, literally the smallest lead recorded from 2006 to 2021, and they use it as absolute proof that a structural political realignment is currently underway.
Moving on to Section 2, Redistricting and Court Rulings.
Shifting gears away from polling data, we're looking at the actual structural mechanics of voting. The source dives into a recent 6-3 Supreme Court ruling and poses a really fundamental question. How does this ruling impact the House map? The commentator interprets this decision as a firm mandate that congressional districts nationwide must now be won based on what they call merit, ideas, and actual voter preference, rather than being drawn along racially engineered lines.
Now, what's genuinely fascinating about this is how stark the ideological divide is laid out in the source material. On one side, the source directly quotes election experts and Democrat leaders who view the ruling as a devastation for democracy. They argue it strips away vital tools used to protect against voting discrimination. On the exact flip side, the commentator's perspective is that this ruling actually liberates voters. They argue it allows people to choose representatives based on policy rather than identity politics, which they claim is going to ultimately dismantle established political machines.
And here are the raw stakes, at least according to the commentator, because maps in states like Florida, Georgia, and Alabama might need to be completely redrawn. The source claims this single Supreme Court ruling could potentially shift 14 to 20 House seats entirely away from Democrats. 14 to 20 seats. In a closely divided Congress, the source frames this as an absolutely catastrophic potential loss for one party and a monumental victory for the other.
To back up the sheer urgency of all this, the source highlights the enforcement side of the equation. There are currently 45 unresolved redistricting disputes across the nation. The commentator cites United States Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Harmy Dillon, who publicly stated a zero-tolerance policy for any state trying to stall or delay the implementation of the Supreme Court's ruling. The source interprets this aggressive DOJ stance as a guarantee that equal protection is going to be enforced immediately, stopping any legal foot-dragging right in its tracks ahead of the midterms. It's really a prime example of how quiet legal mechanics fundamentally shape the elections we vote in.
Okay, Section 3, Michigan Medicaid fraud claims.
We are moving entirely away from the voting booth now and getting straight into state-level financial oversight. So the absolute crucial point to grasp here is this staggering figure, $385 million. The commentary heavily cites an unnamed investigative journalist who claims to have uncovered hundreds of millions of dollars in Medicaid fraud in the state of Michigan. The source takes this massive number and uses it to pivot their entire narrative toward themes of deep institutional corruption and mismanagement. The commentator then walks us through a very specific timeline provided by that investigative journalist, describing how this alleged fraud operates almost like clockwork. Step 1, there's a political transition in the legislature, which is immediately followed by changes to Medicaid billing codes.
Step 2, fraudsters somehow inexplicably know to test bill these exact codes 6 months prior. And Step 3, almost immediately following the political transition, massive multi-million-dollar payouts begin flowing to so-called ghost businesses. So the source doesn't just frame this as some accidental bureaucratic waste. No, they're calling it highly coordinated systemic fraud.
To really drive this point home, the source isolates one genuinely astonishing claim. $118 million of taxpayer money allegedly went to just 21 businesses that had been completely, legally dissolved. Yes, you heard that right. Businesses that literally did not exist on paper anymore were simply receiving massive federal checks. For the commentator, this is presented as the ultimate proof of a broken, totally unmonitored system.
Finally, Section 4, the Spirit Airlines bankruptcy.
Let's move over to the world of federal corporate regulation, specifically the collapse of Spirit Airlines, and see how the source builds a case against government intervention. The narrative follows a really strict timeline. JetBlue attempts to acquire the struggling Spirit Airlines. Then the Biden administration's Department of Justice steps in and blocks the merger on antitrust grounds. Well, unable to survive independently, Spirit Airlines officially declares bankruptcy, which directly leads to massive job losses. The stark reality here, the raw data isolated by the commentator, is that roughly 10,000 Americans found themselves out of work virtually overnight, all due to this bankruptcy. The source uses this devastating human cost to fiercely anchor their critique of federal regulatory actions.
Once again, we are looking at two wildly different interpretations of the exact same event. On one hand, we have the stated goals of the Biden administration and allies like Senator Elizabeth Warren. They originally cheered the blocked merger as a massive victory for travelers, arguing it would protect consumers from monopolies and ensure lower prices. But on the other hand, we have the source's definitive conclusion that this was disastrous government overreach. The commentator argues that by blocking a free market lifeline, the government actually destroyed a business, and the result? 10,000 lost jobs, stranded passengers, and, ironically, less airline competition overall. And that brings us to the end of our breakdown today. It leaves us with a truly fascinating question to ponder. How do disparate events, like a CNN poll about demographic shifts, a dense Supreme Court ruling on redistricting, an investigative report on Michigan Medicaid fraud, and the bankruptcy of a budget airline, how do they get woven together? What we've seen today is exactly how a commentator takes these isolated data points and synthesizes them into a singular, unified worldview. A narrative all about momentum, structural shifts, and the real-world consequences of government action. As you consume media this week, I challenge you to look beyond the individual stories. Ask yourself, how are these pieces being actively assembled to build the larger picture? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking great questions.